world is changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was is lost, but none now live who remember it. You know what I can't stand the most? Posers. People who latch onto something because it's popular, not because they actually like it. At first, they're not a problem. They can be annoying because they don't really know anything about whatever it is they're pretending to like, but they're really confident in that they do. But eventually that can fade. Usually they'll hang around for a bit and either really begin to like that thing or just move on to the next popular thing. But fake fans, they don't move on. They sit. They fester. They want everything to be about them, even if it has nothing to do with whatever it is they're pretending to like. That's usually bad enough. It's enough to break a fandom, just completely ruin everyone's fun by this person dominating everything. But it's worse, much, much worse, when you add in politics, especially identity politics. It's a thing of special magnificence, like so-called Tolkien fans bitching about the lack of diversity in Middle-earth, a fantasy realm based on Celtic, Norse, and Anglo-Saxon cultures. Such is the desperation of these fake fans for representation that they perceive the villain race of orcs as African because they're the only race these fake fans think have dark skin in Middle-earth. And when checked on this, instead of admitting they got it wrong, they accuse real fans of white supremacy. Oh, it's gonna get more retarded as we go along. Case in point, Christina Wombrun's article titled, "Dear Tolkien fans, black people exist." You know it's gonna be bullshit when it starts with this, quote, "As a young black girl growing up in the white suburbs of Michigan, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings granted me some escape from the harsh reality of post-Jim Crow America." Right, Christina, your profile says you received your BA in English in 2019. You don't look that old, so I'm guessing you weren't born in the years just after Jim Crow ended. So you're just being melodramatic. You grew up in the suburbs. Your father was an engineer. You went to college. I really doubt the rough streets of suburban Michigan were that tough for your half-black ass. Take it from a mostly black dude from the south side of Chicago. It's really not that bad. But Christina seems to have bought into the typical critical race theory bullshit about how everyone suspected her black mother couldn't afford anything or was dangerous. Quote, "It wasn't until my teenage years that I recognized these as manifestations of white supremacy." You had to have gone to college to say something that stupid. Your mixed race ass thinking everything is racist is evidence of white supremacy. Right. Then she says, quote, "I recall thinking about Middle-earth during these racist encounters. I remember wondering if Legolas would have tolerated such open bigotry and discrimination." You're talking about the elf who basically wanted to kill dwarves when he saw him at the council. The elf who literally only liked one dwarf, and even then just barely tolerated going with him to Oglarond. The one who starts off racist against dwarves. Did you read the book? Did you watch the films? He would have been the bigot, dumbass. Right there, that statement shows that Christina is a fake fan. She's not a real Tolkien fan because she doesn't even know anything about the character she mentions. Yes, by the end of the story, Legolas and Gimli change their minds about their respective races, but they both start out pretty bigoted, and this is in the books and the films. You can't miss it unless you weren't paying attention. And just to prove how much Christina is a fake fan, she says, quote, "After learning more about Tolkien and his work, I suspect that Legolas might have encouraged it." You know, you would have noticed that if you read the fucking book. This is why fans can't stand people latching onto fandoms when they get popular. Because then you have to deal with people asking and saying things that have already been addressed in the work. But as we'll see, fake fans like Christina can't be bothered to do their homework, even for their own article. Several times in the article she links to things that disprove her point, which she would have noticed if she actually read the link. Instead, she's got this narrative that Tolkien and Tolkien fans are inherently racist because the story and characters are inspired by Celtic, Norse, and Anglo-Saxon culture, and people don't want to change the lore to suit these fake fans' kooky racist politics. Or as Christina says, they're being anti-black. Quote, "My escapism into fantasy was not as safe as I thought. As an adult, I discovered that my beloved text was built upon an internally racist foundation that made no room for me, a black fan. The Lord of the Rings is full of Tolkien's racist and colonialist attitudes." No, it's not. The story is very clear in its anti-racist views. The divide between the elves and dwarves is always presented as misguided and wrong, and it results in numerous wars and conflicts that could have been avoided had these two groups let go of their grudges. A similar attitude plays out with men as they encounter other groups. Their prejudice works against their need to unite against Sauron, which he exploits during the Second and Third Ages. This is especially true when it comes to men's jealousy over immortality and the power of the elves. As the two races divide, it's easier for Sauron to spread lies between them. When the Númenóreans rise to power and eventually turn on those around them, their cruelty to the Easterlings and Haradrim make it easier for Sauron and Saruman to manipulate them in the Third Age. None of this is ever presented as good. The bias and distrust between the races is always presented as a bad thing, something the Ilúvatar didn't want but knew would happen. But that's not what Christine is talking about. What she's talking about is this bullshit theory that the orcs of Middle-earth are supposed to be black. Quote, as scholars such as Helen Young have discussed in detail, orcs in Middle-earth are repeatedly coded as black and shown to be irredeemable. Tolkien explicitly described them in the private letter as squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to the Europeans, least lovely Mongol types. Christina, the last time I checked, Mongols are Asian, not African. And you're ignoring the context of the orcs. They're presented as corrupted versions of men and elves, to the point that Tolkien's never clear on how they came about. Within the lore, it's presumed that they may have been created by Morgoth, as his twisted attempt of making a race of men or elves, or that the original orcs or even some of the current ones are corrupted, tortured elves so twisted by Morgoth that they become this sad race. It's also worth mentioning sallow means yellowing or browning of skin, basically a sickly appearance. That means that the orcs could very well look like men and elves, but just look sickly, not brown skinned like the Africans, or literally black skinned like the orcs from the films. Tolkien didn't use words willy-nilly. If he used the word, he meant it to be there and he knew exactly what it meant. Also, she cites the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, but clearly didn't read the letter. The link talks about the German translation of The Hobbit, which was being negotiated in 1938. The German firm asked whether Tolkien was of Aryan origin. This pissed him off and he wrote 2 potential replies, but only one draft survives. In that reply, Tolkien says, quote, thank you for your letter. I regret that I am not clear as to what you intend by Arish. I am not of Aryan extraction, that is Indo-Iranian. As far as I am aware, none of my ancestors spoke Hindustani, Persian, Gypsy, or any related dialects. But if I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people. Let no one say Tolkien wasn't a cunning linguist. Only an Englishman could insult you so magnificently. First, he checks the dude by informing him that Aryans aren't white by naming the actual Aryan people the German firm probably hates. Then he gets to the real issue. Are you a Jew? And his response is to say, unfortunately, he isn't part of that awesome race. So instead of the link proving Christina's bullshit claim that Tolkien is uber racist, it shows the massive balls on this man to defend Jews to someone he clearly assumes is an anti-Semite. Then Christina says, quote, Tolkien's description of orcs often reduced them to a singular mass or collective entity, a mob of savage and emotionless beings devoid of logic or reasoning. So, Black Lives Matter. Hey, you might be onto something. But seriously, the orcs are described this way because they're meant to represent evil, or as Theoden says, reckless hate. As a Catholic, Tolkien had trouble reconciling this because he didn't believe any race would be inherently or irredeemably evil, and the only real way around this was to avoid fleshing them out. This is partly why the orcs don't have any specific culture or language of their own. The other part is that it plays into how the orcs came to be. Since they're not, presumably, a natural race, they wouldn't develop as a real race would. Instead, they borrow from others around them, twisting and bending it to suit them. But there's nothing that even implies that the orcs are supposed to be black. But Christina won't let something like facts get in her way, quote, making the villains incomprehensible is a very common tactic in racist fiction. And she cites TV tropes, because that's a reliable source. But what she cites doesn't prove her point. She cites fantastic racism, which is defined as, quote, a subset of the old trick of dealing with thorny issues through metaphor. Instead of having the hero encounter racism between any sets of real-world groups, they encounter racism between 2-headed aliens and 3-headed aliens, or between people with earth-themed elemental powers and people with water-themed elemental powers, or between shape-shifting squid people and shape-shifting octopus people. The purpose of the trope is to illustrate racism, not reinforce it, and that's explained later on, quote, if the point of the story is to show the evils of racism, this trope can lead to a broken Aesop if there are in fact good in-universe reasons to discriminate against a certain type of creature. a broken Aesop being where the moral presented doesn't match the original moral that the story actually contained, sometimes resulting in the moral feeling tacked on or hypocritical. That means that fantastic racism is just a descriptor, like saying Lord of the Rings is a fantasy story. It's just describing the way the subject is presented. So what happened here? How is it that Christina got this so wrong when the meaning is clear in the first sentence? Well, it appears that's because she's got a narrative, and she really doesn't care about the facts of the story. She wants Tolkien to be racist, and wants the orcs to be coded as black, and damn it, she's gonna see it that way even if she has to twist a linguist's words to do it. Quote, this passage not only codes orcs as black, it uses specific descriptors, wide and snuffling nostrils, that echo Jim Crow era caricatures. The use of the pronoun it, as well as the animalistic vocabulary, breed, tracker, echoes white supremacist ideologies of purity that differentiate black people as a separate, explicitly subhuman species. Hey Christina, Tolkien was English, and England never had Jim Crow laws. So what the fuck are you talking about? Why would Tolkien, who was in England writing a story featuring Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and Norse folklore and mythology, include Southern American racist imagery in his story? Orcs are not black people. They're not presented as being African. There's actually a group of people in the lore who could be that world's equivalent of Africans. They're called Haradrim. There's also a group called the Farharad who had black skin, and it may literally be black because they're also called half-trolls, or that could just be an insult. Either way, there's nothing in the lore that says orcs are black people. You're the one making that assumption because there aren't any dark-skinned people in the story, and you're so desperate to have black people in Middle-earth that you're claiming the orcs. Jesus, girl, let it go. No one cares about your stupid mixed race hangups, because that's probably where this is coming from. She also mentions that she's queer, and that's probably causing this bullshit too. You don't fit in, and so you've latched onto a popular franchise and tried to make it conform to you, and found out that its fanbase wasn't having it, and now you're pitching a fit, saying shit like, quote, there's a clear hesitancy from both the fandom and academic perspective to have serious dialogues about how these racist passages translate into fan spaces and persist in contemporary discussions. No, there isn't. People just don't want to deal with your race-baiting bullshit. I'm black. I'm a Lord of the Rings fan. Et Chicago Indureno Tulian. Si no me moru van Hilden Yarten Ambarmeta. No one has ever told me that I can't like Lord of the Rings. No one has ever been racist towards me over liking the franchise. But then again, I don't go around trying to change the lore to make characters black because I'm black. The issue as I see it is that fake fans like Christina want everything to be about them and their identity crises. Everything needs to focus on their race, their sex, their sexuality, and whenever anyone rejects this, it's considered bigotry, not someone protecting their space from a group hell-bent on destroying it. Christina harps on how fantasy fans will accept mythological races, but not black faces in white fandom spaces, ignoring that those same evil white fans also call bullshit when some Caucasian ends up in an Asian or Mesoamerican-based fantasy. It's not that people won't accept black fantasy characters, it's that whenever you pull from the real world rules apply. We know Africans weren't in medieval Europe, so seeing scores of African people in a medieval setting with no plausible explanation for why or how this happened makes no sense, especially if it's the same environmental and geographical setup. If you want black people in a Lord of the Rings style setting, you need to do it like A Song of Ice and Fire, building out the cultures in plausible ways so that it makes sense those people would be in those areas. But then this also applies to fantasy races. If you have Japanese kami in a Celtic setting, you need to explain that. That's all anyone's asking for. No one had a problem with Grey Worm being black because it made sense in the world of Westeros. But if Tyrion was black, it wouldn't make any sense. See? But Christina wants to bitch, and so bitch she does, ironically proving she's a fake fangirl rightly being taken to task by actual Tolkien fans. Quote, for instance, I enjoyed reading The Hobbit in my youth, but I did not read the other books in the Lord of the Rings series until adulthood. I chose instead to watch the Peter Jackson films, which I consumed in a single weekend. Given the length in Tolkien's writing style, more history book than fantasy novel, this is the case for many fans. Despite what the gatekeepers might say, that does not mean I cannot call myself a fan if I want. Oh, you can call yourself a fan. You're just not a Tolkien fan. You're a Peter Jackson fan. Look, I love the Lord of the Rings films. I watched each film, both theatrical and extended cuts, over 40 times each. At one point, I could listen to the soundtrack and tell you which film and which version of the film the music came from. If you give me a timestamp, I can probably still tell you what happened in the film at that time. I've watched these films so much I can quote the sound effects commentary track. I was and I am obsessed with these movies, and my love of the movies and their appendices made me read the books, and I fell in love with the books, especially the Silmarillion. My favorite scene is when Fingolfin challenges Morgoth, and it plays out like an anime battle. Go and read it, and then imagine it's drawn by the guy who draws One Punch Man. Perfection. I've read The Silmarillion, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings every year since 2003. I love these books because I watched the films. That's what makes me a fan. Learning the languages, learning the lore, seeing the different ways Tolkien went with the story with the Christopher Tolkien books. There's nothing wrong with loving the films, but if that's the extent of your knowledge of the lore, I don't really think you can call yourself a Tolkien fan any more than listening to Bitches Brew and Headhunters makes you a jazz fan. And Christina proves she's really not a fan. Quote, after the release of Lord of the Rings Online, an MMO video game, in April 2007, I attempted to get more involved with the Tolkien fandom through online forums. However, I noticed how often my knowledge and expertise were challenged to prove I was a real fan. So you were quizzed by fans and got pissy when you didn't know the answers. Baby girl, don't you know that's what fans do? If you were a jazz fan, especially if you played music, and someone called a song and you didn't know it, you'd be out the group. They'd boot you out the venue. It'd be embarrassing not to know a famous jazz song, or not know how to play a certain phrase. And if the sum of your knowledge came from a handful of successful albums, non-jazz fans would clown you about that, and you deserve it. Why don't you know about the thing you claim to love? When I brought up a lack of darker skin tones for the elves in the game, I was told by other fans that the game's creators were following an accurate description of the book. Whether this is true or not in the books, and it's debatable, that does not mean the game had to follow suit. Yeah, it does if they were trying to be accurate to the book. It's not debatable. The Eldar are pretty much all described as having fair skin. The darkest they ever seem to get is olive skin, so no darker than a Spaniard or a Greek. They would never even be Sicilian dark. It just doesn't happen anywhere in the text at all. Their hair colors and eye colors give it away. They're clearly Nordic, Celtic, and Anglo-Saxon in their descriptions. If you're making a game based on the lore, which is what the fans would want, there would never be dark-skinned elves. It just wouldn't happen. But she says, quote, this choice, made by the developers and reinforced by the fans, clearly relayed to me that I, and my skin, was not really welcome. Ain't nobody said nothing about your fucking skin. Why you being so melodramatic? This may come as a shock, but you can still like characters who don't look like you. Every fantasy race doesn't need to be individualized for you. If there's a race that lives predominantly in a northern environment that gets less sunlight at certain parts of the year, they're going to be pale unless they migrated there. In the Eldar's case, they were created by Iluvatar and lived in Middle-earth before there was even a sun. They lived under starlight, which is why they find it to be the fairest light, and would explain why they're so pale-skinned. It's not a conspiracy to keep your half-black ass out. It's just part of the lore. Get over it. But she says, quote, if I want to engage with and criticize the lore of Middle-earth, I would need to find a safer space. I later learned that this was not an uncommon experience for black fans, especially queer black women, who often feel isolated and silenced in such spaces. Yeah, because your black asses won't shut the fuck up about being queer black women. You're not there to be fans, you're there to criticize, and no real fan wants to put up with that all the time. If you're so focused on trying to tear down a work in its fandom that you feel the need to resist, you don't belong in that fandom and you're not wanted. Nobody wants you around if you're spending all your time looking for these bullshit microaggressions so you can play the victim because you want to be special. And definitely no one's going to put up with you calling them white supremacists because they like Lord of the Rings the way it is and don't want you changing Tolkien's world to suit your racist politics. If that's all you want to do, then like they said, isn't there a black-centered fandom you can be a part of? I know the answer is no, because despite all the complaints about the lack of inclusivity and representation, nobody actually wants to make a black version of Lord of the Rings. You're not interested in Afrocentric fantasies, you just want control. And we saw that with how black folks acted when the Black Panther movie came out, immediately telling white people they couldn't like the movie, that they shouldn't see it until after black people had their fill, and that they couldn't cosplay as Black Panther because that would be cultural appropriation of a character created by two Jewish men. For all your claims about wanting inclusivity, you fake fans get real exclusive and gatekeepy when you get a taste of power, and that results in stupid racist shit like this, quote, I recognize that many black fans choose to sever ties with a beloved fandom due to the horrendous nature of its community. I too considered leaving the fandom. Engaging with racist trolls was a drain on my mental health, but leaving felt like giving into their wishes to erase me and my community. Instead, I no longer engage directly with white-centered fandom/fan spaces, and instead participate largely in black-centered and led communities for fans of fantasy/sci-fi works. So, to fight racism, you built a racist community. How do you expect to resist and change anyone's mind when you're refusing to talk to the people whose minds you want to change? Whose minds do you think you're going to change by resisting when you say you have a narrative that you want to, quote, endorsed and weaponized to proclaim our spot within fandom spaces. You're attacking people for being fans and you wonder why we don't want you in our groups. Listen, Christina, you and all the other fake Tolkien fans, no one cares. No one cares about your race, your sex, your sexuality, your mulatto identity crisis, or your racist politics. All we care about is if you know about the thing you claim to love, and it's clear, crystal clear, you know fuck all about Middle-earth, J.R.R. Tolkien, fantasy stories, or medievalism. You're welcome to pose wherever the fuck you want, but you can't do it here. You're not gonna call every Tolkien fan racist or the fandom white supremacy. You're not gonna trash the lore. You're not gonna impugn Tolkien's character by lying about his opinions. If you want to do that shit, you can go. Don't let the gates of Moria hit you on the way out. If you act right, you can stay. You want to act like a stuck-up racist fool? Namarie. Na hiruvaye angamando. Na ilya hiruva. Namarie. But what do I know? I'm just some guy. And Christina, since I know you're watching, since you want to act like a child and file false privacy complaints, claiming it's a violation of your privacy to show an image you put in your public bio on a public website, Namarie.